what has been going on. The Institute for Statecraft was hacked several weeks ago, and numerous documents were published and amplified by Kremlin news channels. The Russian state media campaign which followed it fits with a wider pattern of Russian disinformation against the UK. This campaign's objective is clear. It is yet another example of Russian disinformation intended to confuse audiences and discredit an organisation which is working independently to tackle the threat of disinformation. The current Russian disinformation activity is precisely the sort of disinformation that this project is designed to counter. It's regrettable, but perhaps rather unsurprising, that some have been fooled and have used it to make accusations about British politics in exactly the way this malign activity might have hoped for. While this is going on in the UK, the sort of activity which we do fund is doing its utmost to counter Russian disinformation overseas, which is undermining democracy and its institutions ever more widely across the world. The FCO has given a grant to the Institute of Statecraft this financial year of nearly £2 million. Our agreement, written into the contract with the Institute, specifically states that the grant must not be used to support activity intended to influence or attempt to influence the UK Parliament, government or political parties. We have not seen any evidence that the Integrity Initiative have breached this obligation, and the accusation that government money has been used for domestic political purposes is utterly unfounded, and I say once again to the Right Honourable Lady that no Foreign Office funding is used for their UK domestic activity, and she can look at me as aghast as she likes, but the money that comes from the Foreign Office is used for activity overseas, and she should accept that as the and if she doesn't accept it, she should say in terms what she is accusing me of, because that would be a breach of the forms of the House.
Mr. Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It would clearly be concerning if any Foreign Office money was being used for party political activities, but I welcome the Minister's reassurances. Would he confirm, though, that an investigation has been launched to see what has happened, and that if when a proper independent investigation brought proper conclusions out, he would take action on them?
Perhaps one of the accurate things the Right Honourable Lady says, that when I was interviewed on Radio 4 and this was sprung on me, I said I would look into it straight away. And I did. And I have established the facts. And I am satisfied that our money does not go to fund any kind of UK domestic activity.
Stephen?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if I may, I've been accused of speaking rubbish by the Honourable Lady, and she should mark her words carefully before she bellows untruths at me across the House.
Order. Nobody should bellow across the House from either side. I know that the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Minister of State, is very well able to look after himself. The word rubbish, sadly, is used relatively frequently in the House, and it's certainly not unparliamentary. It is a matter of taste rather than of order, and I'm glad to see the Right Honourable Gentleman breaking out into a smile, but it would be more seemly if colleagues would conduct these exchanges in a slightly more restrained fashion. I look now to that end, in hope and possibly in anticipation, to Mr. Stephen Gethin's.
Speaker, well, Mr. Speaker, can I start on that? And what I would like to put on the record is that there are a number of FCO-funded NGOs who do extraordinary work in the most difficult of circumstances. Before I came to this place, I worked in the South Caucasus and the Western Balkans, where many of those organisations do extraordinary work, and they deserve our support for doing that. But what they deserve more than anything else is they need to know that we have full openness and transparency from the Foreign Office. Our most powerful tool against any Russian misinformation is that we have respect for the rule of law, the democratic process, and critically, transparency. We owe it to them who are working in these organisations, and I know that the Minister will be well aware of many of those who work in very difficult circumstances, who themselves find themselves at the hard edge of Russian disinformation campaigns. So, can I ask that we need to have confidence in our democratic process? There should be no undermining of politicians, be they Labour, SNP, Conservative or anybody else. Can I further ask that what further steps he will take to ensure that impartiality and integrity goes to the very heart of all funding coming from the Foreign Office. And I'm sure, and I hope he'll take the tone of the question that I'm putting to him, and I'm sure he'll agree with me that those who are doing difficult work in difficult conflict environments deserve the full support of this House and know that they've got the back of the Foreign Office as well on that.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman both for what he has asked, but also the tone in which he's asked it. He has experience of this, and I share pretty well everything he's just said. What this Integrity Initiative is endeavouring to do in its activity abroad is to deliver exactly the sort of transparency in order to counter fake news and disinformation in the way that I think the honourable member and indeed all of us would hope. Indeed, the Right Honourable Lady in her opening remarks said that she would support that sort of activity. What's more, this is a charity which is actually incorporated in Scotland, and so it's subject to the Scottish Charitable Regulator, and that kind of non-partisan activity is required. What they have done within the UK is that they have some automatic retweeting of stories that relate to Russia. That, of course, in some occasions, mentions the honourable gentleman. It could equally mention the right honourable gentleman in the opposition. It could equally mention a Conservative, as indeed it has done on many occasions, and it has been judged to be no more than a non-partisan repetition of stories that relate to Russia.
Sir Desmond Swain.
I'm reassured to know that we're taking on Russian misinformation. I'm right to be, aren't I?
I say to my right honourable friend, yes, he is right to be, and the whole House should appreciate that this is an ever-increasing challenge, and it's one that we need to meet in the cyber field as we do in the information field, and that's what we're doing. And again, if the right honourable gentleman says from a sedentary position in a united way, yes, and she could add to that unity by recognising the truth of what I've said instead of denying it in her normal way.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The Minister said that the Institute for Statecraft was hacked several weeks ago. Could you just clarify for the House today whether that hacking extended to the Twitter account of the Integrity Initiative, which has been retweeting articles that undoubtedly are critical of my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, and the Opposition's policy?
The answer is I don't know, but if it's a Twitter account, it's publicly available anyway. So it's the information that was not publicly available that was hacked, and I deplore that hack, but that is what is now being used by Russian-inspired sources in order to create the sort of encounters we're witnessing here today.
Mr. Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, this is the first time I think I've come across an accusation from a Labour Party spokesperson that retweeting a New Statesman article was something that meant, quote, smears against Labour, unquote. But if it is the case that there is an implication of this, despite the fact that the government's support, financial support, has nothing to do with its UK activities, would my right honourable friend reassure members today that if there was any evidence found that the Institute is involved in efforts to discredit the party opposite, then he would unequivocally condemn such behaviour?
Yes, if our funding were being used for that, then yes, I would, and the contract would be withdrawn. But I hear again from the Labour front bench an accusation that I have categorically denied today, that Foreign Office funding is paying for UK Twitter activity and the management of their account. It is not. And I would say to the honourable gentleman on the front bench who's been shouting at me that he should withdraw this accusation, because I have spoken in honesty to the House and he should recognise it as such.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Russia has been pushing the boundaries with its international interference and international disruption. We've seen incidents like Salisbury and the Ukraine. Our defences against cyber attack will be depleted if we leave the European Union. So can he tell the House what plans have been drawn up to increase the skills and resources to counter such cyber attacks in the future?
We are one of the leaders of cyber defence and indeed assist other countries in learning the techniques that are necessary to protect against the sort of hacking we're discussing in part today. So yes, I am confident, and I have enormous confidence in the professional competence of our officials in defending this country about cyber attacks and malign cyber activity.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
How sure are we that it was the Russians behind this hack? And if we are sure, what are we going to do by way of response?
Well, one of the responses, of course, is to counter in the sort of way we are doing in this House today. Unfortunately, I don't have as many allies across the chamber as I would like to have in so doing. We know the origin of the attack because it shares exactly the same pattern that we have seen in previous attacks.
Mike Gates.
Mr. Speaker, the Russians are engaged in hybrid cyber warfare against our country and many others. We seem to play by different rules to them. What are we doing to counter the nefarious activities of the Russian propaganda channel RT and Sputnik?
We do indeed play by the rules because we have integrity in upholding the rule of law and playing within or acting within the confines of our own law. That, some might say, puts us at a disadvantage because when other people break the rules, they try and get the better of us. But we have strong cyber defences, and the kind of activity that the Integrity Initiative is doing is designed to counter the sort of activity the Honourable Gentleman rightly refers to. And it saddens me, it dismays me that I have not got the full support of the front bench opposite in defending what we are doing.
Julian Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the absolute clarity of the Minister's statement and his refuting of these allegations. And I also welcome the work of the Institute for Statecraft. Does the Minister agree with me, though, that we need to double down on this work? Because the reality is that the DCMS Select Committee has shown the danger to our democracy, our very way of life, through Russian disinformation. And frankly, we should not be falling into their traps and aping the sort of paranoia that we've seen in the coverage of this, in the likes, let's say, of the Canary and those types of publications.
I fully agree with my honourable friend. We should not be taken for a sucker, and if we allow malign forces to divide us and then try and rule over us, then that is what will have happened to us. And again, I urge the front bench of Her Majesty's opposition to appreciate that this is a proper part of government activity within the rules, according to a contract, and it is really, I think, behoven on them to accept the assurances that have been so clearly and openly given today.
Tom Brake.
Speaker, on the subject of allegations of Russian influence, could I ask the Minister whether he's aware of concerns about some activities of peers in the House of Lords who are representing Russian companies, including, for instance, Lord Truscott, who's the remunerated chairman of the advisory board of Russian Gold Fund, which is a private equity investment fund, about which it is possible to find out precisely nothing in terms of who is investing it and where the money is going.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think it's for me to comment on the propriety or otherwise of any member of the House of Lords. They, of course, have their own standard rules, and it is for that House to apply those rules as it sees fit.
Bob Blackman.
Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend for the robust way that he's answered these questions? Can he also make sure that the Institute reviews its editorial policy so that we counter Russian fake news and disinformation, but also do not fall foul of criticising UK politicians?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for asking that question, because I'm very happy to say yes to it, because I can assure him and the House, through you, Mr. Speaker, that when it comes to challenging officials on any issue, I do so very, very robustly in order to try and establish the highest standards of activity in the Foreign Office in everything we do. And therefore, in response to this, I have certainly been grilling officials to find out exactly what's happening, and I have asked them to engage with the Institute of Statecraft to look at their editorial policy in order to make sure that there is and will remain an absolute clear division between domestic activity which they do under their charitable rules and any overseas activity which we fund, which of course is subject to the contract we have.
Free to do it.
Chris Bryant.
I completely support any attempt to deal with misinformation campaigns, whether they originate from Russia or Saudi Arabia or the hard right in the United States of America or Syria or, for that matter, in Catalonia last year. So I want to make sure that a project like this really works. But it's not going to have the confidence of the whole nation unless we're able to see some changes in the way it operates in this particular case. And I would have more confidence if the government were to engage in the kind of investigation that is ongoing in Russia, in the United States of America, into Russian involvement in democratic processes in this country. Why can't we have that investigation?
Well, again, that's an area where, there is an enormous amount of work going on in government where I think I share the Right Honourable Gentleman's concerns. I think we see all sorts of social media activity, and we've seen, I think, completely verified activity of Russian intervention in democratic processes, such as the election in Montenegro and perhaps the referendum in Catalonia. So that is, if you like, an addition to the full spectrum of activity which we're specifically discussing in this question this morning.
Sir Christopher Chope.
Mr. Speaker, can my right honourable friend explain why the government still is not against expelling or in favour of expelling the Russian Federation from the Council of Europe? Because the Russian Federation is in breach of all its international obligations, and yet the government isn't doing what it could do, which is expel it from the Council of Europe.
No, I understand what my honourable friend is saying, but I think a matter of that sort is for the Council of Europe, and the parliamentary representatives are, I know, discussing that. What Russia has done is not pay its dues, and I know that the question is, of course, being discussed on a regular basis.
Jenny Chapman.
Mr. Speaker, can I just observe that the honourable gentleman does seem to be rather affronted by the anger felt on this side of the House, and particularly by my front bench colleagues on this issue, and he really needn't to. He ought to be sharing in that anger. Does he think that the investigation that he's undertaken so far is sufficient, or does he plan any further inquiry into this matter? Does he think he's done enough?
Well, I do not share in the anger, because I think the accusations that are being made are both misplaced and have been categorically denied, and Right Honourable, in particular, ladies and gentlemen in this House, should accept the assurance on that basis.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted the Foreign Office are spending money trying to counter the disinformation and fake news that's coming from not just Russia, but as my honourable friend from the Rhondda said, all over the world. But can I just ask the Minister what discussions or comments he's given to this organisation to impress upon them that their domestic use of their Twitter account, whether right or wrong, may be undermining what they're trying to do internationally?
I actually think that is a perfectly fair question about whether their domestic activity somehow taints the legitimate and Foreign Office funded international activity. What I resent very deeply is members of this House not accepting the assurances that are given that Foreign Office funding does not pay for that domestic activity. What I would say in its defence is I think that all it does is forward from what are already open website articles anything that happens to mention Russia. It is deemed to have done so on a non-partisan basis, so inasmuch as it may occasionally mention the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of Her Majesty's Opposition, it could also do so for anyone on the Conservative side. And that is the distinction that ought to be accepted and understood, particularly on the front bench here. But I have undertaken to conduct exactly that sort of review, because I think it's very important that the activity we're doing is clear and distinct and not in any way muddled with the sort of activity the Honourable Gentleman is describing.
Ian